Hi everyone, my name is Frederic Johnson and I work at the Cardano Foundation as Technical Project Manager. In this talk, we will be looking at the Cardano Improvement Proposal process, which is a way to propose and process proposals for the Cardano ecosystem. So I will first go over a bit of background and history, discuss where improvement proposals came from, how we get here, and define the CIP framework generally. We will explore the CIP process itself, as in how a CIP goes from an idea to being added to the CIP repository. Then the next section will look at the CIP itself, the types, the format, the structure, and content. Later in the talk, we'll discuss implications and interactions with the ecosystem before opening up into the greater Voltaire conversation. So, three main goals to this talk: thoroughly explain what a CIP is, outline the CIP process, and clarify how one might get involved. First things first. The CIP isn't Voltaire, but the CIP belongs to Voltaire. So as the lines blur and when we try to look at one or the others, it's useful to keep that in mind, as in the CIP is not Voltaire, but CIP belonged to Voltaire. We'll look back to that later in the talk. Base concepts. So a repository is a base concept to this talk that we really want to drill in. So a repository is where you keep all the codes. An instance is where that code gets executed. So these days, many folks use services like GitHub or GitLab to store their code. That's the repository, but they run it locally from their machine. So let's say you're trying to run a node, and you might, for example, pull it from IOHK's repository. You can get the code from their public GitHub. You download it on your computer, and then you run it on your local machine. So the instance of the node is physically located on your computer. The repository is meanwhile yet on IOHK's GitHub, keeping track of all the code change, the instructions, and everything else. It's kind of like the blueprint. You have the blueprint that is stored somewhere, and the actual item that you build with it is something else. And that's going to come into focus later when we dig further into the CIPs themselves. The ledger. So a ledger that keeps track of transactions from A to B, B to Z. It is the set of transactions that facilitates the greater chain of keeping track of those transactions. So because we're working with crypto and we're familiar with the process, those transactions are typically broken down into blocks that are chained together, cryptographically chained together to render secure. And this is the concept of blockchain that you should be familiar with. The set of blocks is the set of transactions that have been happening. The blockchain is essentially distributed across the network of nodes as it propagates through the network, and the nodes are validating / creating the blocks, as in validating transactions, creating the blocks. The blockchain itself lives, or it can be thought of as the collection of the living instances of nodes active on the network, plus the associated ledger. So going back to the concept of repository, to drive the point home, one single repository with the code could deploy 1 million instances of a node. So on-chain versus off-chain. Typically, when we talk about on-chain versus off-chain, we're talking about transaction. On-chain means on the blockchain. Off-chain means off. So we're talking about CIPs right now. We're just looking at the the separation between the repository versus the living instance of the blockchain. So again, the CIP is intently off-chain, as in it doesn't connect directly to the living blockchain, to Cardano itself. So the Cardano Improvement Proposal is an off-chain process that lives off-chain, as in currently the GitHub repository of the Cardano Foundation. The historical roots. So if the protocol belongs to no one, how can no one collaborate on things? We were talking a lot about decentralization, and Satoshi disappeared after Bitcoin. But if nobody's really in charge, how can we establish something to work together? Who gets to handle? Are we poised to fraction and just work as smaller entities? So the history is that in 2011, Amir Taki pushed out the BIP 001, which was the first one, which proposed a process by which people could coordinate to really improve the protocol as a whole. That proved to be very successful. It's still a process used to this day, and currently there's hundreds of proposals that have been pushed out and multiple flavors of that are associated with other chains. It's a useful tool. It's off-chain, which means it's not directly connected, and people can try to propose proposals that are conflicting with the main implementation or even conflicting between other proposals. It's also public. People can discuss, they can see, and it's source controlled. So if something happens, you can always go back to the original version. So people quickly realized the benefits, and it started being implemented across other chains that had a public-facing element. Of course, you don't really need a communication platform when you're not ready to work with others, or when you're working on your own, or when you're intently just working on something special that is not public. And Cardano, the work and efforts were mostly internal to IOHK the past 5 years. There was, of course, work with Emirgo and other people working as other entities, but most of it was very much internal, so there was no real need for communication. Enter Shelley. Shelley and Decentralization has started coming out in December of last year, is closing out on July 29th of this year, and functionally opens up to decentralization. This is no longer a centralized issue. This is the opening up to stake pools, proof of stake, and so on. So on that end, it clearly became apparent that we needed to coordinate to set up a group effort to establish a platform to coordinate between ourselves and with the community and open up the door to people collaborating with the greater ecosystem. So this was, as in the CIP effort, was a group effort. It was led by the Cardano Foundation, but it involved Emirgo and IOHK in very continuous, close collaboration. The considerations that went into this project, we started looking at what was done previously, the existing systems, what worked, what didn't work, what could be improved, and where we should try to reuse components that were already in place. We really narrowed it down to simplicity and trying to make it understandable. It seemed like there was a lot of confusion, so we hope that this talk also helps clarify items and that this can be propagated. So, concepts. What is a CIP? A CIP is a formalized proposal related to the Cardano protocol. It's a Cardano improvement proposal. It's a proposal to improve Cardano one way or another. It is stored in a GitHub repository at the Cardano Foundation CIP GitHub repo. So it is publicly accessible, publicly visible, and this is a place where you can make a proposal yourself. The CIP process, meanwhile, is the process by which an idea gets to transform to become a CIP. So that process involves discussion, review, feedback with the community, a little bit of research, and then the formalization involves CIP editors and people that will help guide you through that process so that it can go to the CIP repository itself. And a little bit further of disambiguation. So a CIP refers to a specific proposal, while the CIP process refers to how the proposals are processed. And CIPs, as a plural, might refer to the set or the entire collection of CIPs in the GitHub repository. Now, let's look at the process a little bit. The CIP process is intent to help you put your idea, your Cardano idea, into gear and push it out into a CIP. Now, the CIP is intently focused on the Cardano ecosystem, but it has to be something that can be reusable by others. It's not something that can be a one-off implementation. The improvement proposal processes are functionally meta processes. They're trying to talk about something that is not the protocol itself, but they help to improve the protocol itself. So there is some level of confusion, but hopefully once you've tried to push out a couple of CIPs, once you've gotten into working with it, that it becomes a little simpler to understand. So if we try to go into simplification, we have three group of or three actors within that process. You have the author of a CIP, the community gets involved, and editors. The first part of that process is the discussion phase. The author typically words out his idea in a forum or other social media platform and starts discussing with the community. Once he gathers that enough of an interest has been raised, that idea will be formalized into a CIP form and then tried to publish it to the CIP GitHub repository. So that's going to be a pull request to the Cardano Foundation repo. So that's that demarcation between the discussion and the CIP section. Once it's actually accepted and formally agreed by the by the CIP editors in the CIP repo, it gets to be formally processed through a set of statuses. So the first part of that discussion really mostly involves author and community, and the second part typically involves mostly author and editors, but everyone is actually involved in all of those. Again, author acts as champion. He explores the idea, puts it in CIP form. He makes sure that it doesn't exist already in the repository, and he also processes and adds the comments of the community within that CIP. The community gets to participate, discuss, bounce ideas, and functionally speaks up when something doesn't sound right or something is missing. The editors review, shape, they help the author frame the CIP. They very much also provide quality control, make sure that it is the appropriate format, make sure that due process is actually happening, make sure that it actually makes sense and that the community wants that CIP. Here's a more detailed version of the prior diagram. You can see the early idea and community discussion right here. Those feed into the actual GitHub repository. So the rectangles that you can see on screen right here are actual statuses once a CIP has made it in the CIP GitHub repository. So at first it enters as a draft CIP. It's been drafted, it's been approved by the editors as well formatted and demonstrating proper intent. From the draft status, the typical path is towards active. So it's draft to proposed to active. And every transition has required criteria that have to be met either by the author or by the CIP itself or by the implementers. For example, for a process CIP to move from draft to proposed, the author should deem it ready and have a clear plan towards active. This might be something along the lines of the CIP will be discussed on forum for 60 days, or these could be observed and set out and very much CIP specific. So it depends on the CIP itself. Of course, there's other statuses: on hold, rejected, obsolete. We try to keep the statuses simple at this point, and we hope that they do make sense to you. By the way, you can search for this specific diagram in the CIP1 on the GitHub repository, and it should explain it in greater details. So if we try to break it down from each of those actors' point of views, and we try to build up the timeline of how an idea gets to be added to the CIP repository. We have all three bands. We have the author band, the community band, and the editors band right here. Right here, this diagram is only depicting the early pre-CIP repository. So this is the discussion. So we have the author that has the idea, that discusses it with the community. The idea might make sense, the idea might be something wrong, but eventually it turns out that someone actually likes that idea, and the editors don't really have to be involved at this point. They just get to be aware of the conversation maybe, but it's not something that is required. So the community likes the idea, the author decides, okay, I should first check if the idea has already been proposed. Maybe it's someone is already working on that idea, maybe something else is happening. I mean, does it exist? So the author checks the GitHub repository, maybe does a summary search in the forums, and apparently nothing comes up. So he formalizes the idea in CIP format. So he just takes the templated example in the CIP GitHub repository. There's a template file, and formalizes it as the specified format, then posts that format in the Cardano forum, like discusses that CIP as being potentially implemented soon. This gives the opportunity to the community to provide feedback and look back on what might be missing for the CIP or what might not be correct in the CIP. So from that point, the author submits a pull request to the CIP repo. And that's a pull request for the CIP as draft status. And this is going to be actually visible on the CIP repository on GitHub for everyone to see that there's a pull request there, and for the editors to review themselves. Editors will review, and they'll review for format, they'll review for intent, they'll review for due process. And it's a low barrier of entry intently to keep people able to submit ideas that might even be controversial. So from there, it'll be accepted. But before we go into detail, I just want to pause for a second to just remind people that GitHub doesn't have to be too scary or blocking path to proposing ideas. Again, when you go into GitHub, even if you don't have a GitHub account, you can create an account. You can go to the Cardano Foundation GitHub CIP repository. You can click the button that says fork, and it'll create a copy of the entire repository under your name, and you'll be able to make some changes to a file, let's say the template file, and create your own CIP pull request. So you'll call it adding an extra field to transaction.markdown. And then you'll be able to create a pull request. What a pull request is requesting the Cardano Foundation repository to pull in your changes. And this is something that the editors will see. And if it is well formatted, likely the editors will just say, okay, let's pull this in. And then from that point, it will get assigned its own number, and it'll be an official CIP in the CIP GitHub repository. If GitHub is too scary, I mean, there's always plenty of people in the community that are involved and are aware and are willing to jump in to help you. Functionally, the idea is to start the conversation with the community so someone is able to step in. There can be multiple authors to CIP. It is a collaborative effort, and editors are there to help you. So assuming that the pull request went through the review process, editors actually approved it, then we transition into the CIP being added to the repository. Once a CIP has been added to the repository, it is officially in draft status. It has its number that has been assigned. Originally, it shouldn't have a number assigned by itself, otherwise people might assign conflicting numbers. This is something that CIP editors do. But once it's in the repository, it is in draft format. The author can continue to change and tweak the CIP until satisfied. And once he's satisfied with the current state of things and the feedback from the community and editors seem to be all right, then he gets to set up a new pull request so that editors can check whether it is worth transitioning that CIP to proposed status. And again, specific types of CIPs require specific transitions. Those are outlined in detail in CIP 1, and we'll talk to some of those in a little bit. So from draft to proposed to active. The main distinction between proposed and active is that active is supposed to have a clear set of outlined criteria that were set up at the beginning of draft, called the plan to active. So that might be very different for multiple different types of CIPs. It might be a time lock like 60 days, or it might be like 5 out of 6 implementation, or it might be some other element. Notably, for example, for standards track or protocol changes, it might be a working implementation required. So this is the formal processing. This is all happening within the CIP GitHub repository. The bird's eye view of the process gives you those three tracks: author, community, editors, and you can clearly see the distinction from the moment a CIP is officially accepted by the CIP editors in the GitHub repository. So CIP editors, by the way, are a group of individuals that are from IOHK, Imurgo, and the Cardano Foundation that are intently desiring to help the community and guide people through that process of submitting proposals as needed. They're there to help you, but they also there to help do quality control, so that we don't end up with too many CIPs that are either duplicates or that are poorly formatted or hard to read or not well intended for the community. They meet every 2 weeks, and there's an open door to the community so that people who feel particularly strongly about one CIP being discussed or another get an opportunity to involve themselves in that process. There's also the plan down the line to open that gate, as in CIP editorship, to the community, and this is something that we'll be adding up in the coming month. On medicine. So CIP1 describes the CIP process. It went through the very own CIP process it was defining. And by that, we mean that it was an idea that was discussed, and it was an idea that was collaboratively discussed. It went through a forum post in the forums.cardano.org. Then it went through the pull request, the review, and then it went through the different statuses itself. So it went through the draft status, then proposed, then finally to active. And it actually has been active for about 2 weeks right now. And this is the open invitation for the interested individual to start proposing CIPs. We currently have about six or 8 pull requests that are currently awaiting review, and we've started looking at a couple of those. So let's talk a little bit about the CIP itself, so a CIP. The formal definition is a Cardano improvement proposal is a formalized design document for the Cardano community, providing information or describing a new feature for the Cardano network, its processes or environment in a concise and technically sufficient manner. It's a little bit wordy, but hopefully it makes sense. Again, it's a formal design document, and it can provide information, it can describe a process, or it can even propose a change to the Cardano protocol itself. The types. So 3 types for a CIP. A CIP can be a standards track CIP, a process CIP, or an informational CIP. The way that works is you can imagine it as groups of CIPs, in this case. A standards track group, a process group, and an informational group. Again, CIP1, which is the CIP process. That's actually the title of that CIP. That CIP1 defines the individual type. So if you go in CIP1, you'll read more about the standards track, the process, the informational CIP. Standards track CIP, they affect the ecosystem generally. There might be a protocol change, and they should typically have 2 parts. So the design part and the implementation part. The implementation part is working code. So if you want to change something and you have a grand design, it is likely on you to try to implement it unless you have the support of greater organizations. The process CIP, it describes a process surrounding Cardano, and it might be something like, the CIP process itself, or it might be something like a bug bounty or bug reporting process or other. Informational CIP provides general guidelines or information regarding something that has already been implemented. So the informational tries to help people by explaining things. Going back to those groupings, we can look at the standards track grouping, and an example might be a proposal to add an additional metadata field to transactions that might be relevant to one individual, or maybe like 2 or 3, and you have like 2 groups, and one group might decide to implement that CIP, the other group might not be into it or might have no need for it. Meanwhile, a bug bounty proposal platform, either a bug bounty or let's say a bug reporting process. How do you report a bug for the Cardano platform? That might be the next CIP that someone might want to propose. An informational CIP, and the informational CIP group, an example might be an in-depth description of the staking mechanisms. This might be something that could be relevant for, let's say, stake pools or others. So why do we want to format and categorize and type all of this? Well, if we don't have the format, we get lost in semantics or language, and when someone says something, the person on the receiving end is only able to understand a fraction of that. So let's say that I say apple to you. For me, it might mean Granny Smith, but for you, it might mean Red Delicious. So it's really a matter of trying to establish that baseline that people can communicate at without actually just having everything be code. Because remember, this CIP or the entire CIP framework is off-chain specifically so that it's disconnected from the blockchain and all of that. So this is just like a way to propose proposals. So of course, once we've had that format and we're aware of it, then it's easier to just start opening up those conversations. People know where to look, people know what to add and what to frame things or how to explain them a little bit better, particularly when they can references other CIP or others. So where CIPs live is on the Cardano Foundation GitHub page. You can find it at that URL. The CIP, the individual CIP themselves are made up of a collection of files. So an individual CIP is going to live within and the greater CIP GitHub repository, but like within its own. So let's say CIP6 is going to live within CIP6's subdirectory on the GitHub, and within that subdirectory, you'd have a main file you should look at, which is the CIP .markdown CIPX in there, but it should be CIP6, and that will explain in greater detail what that CIP is about. So this is what exploring the GitHub looks like. Just so for people who are not familiar with it, you'll get to have a closer look at this. So you can see that it's going to the GitHub Cardano Foundation /CIPs URL. And what you see is a collection of files. And this is the folder that you're actually looking at. CIP1, that one will have all the relevant files for the CIP1 itself. All of those files, we just went into it. You can see that we're now inside that CIP1 subdirectory. You can see the CIP1 markdown and the other files like the license, the A diagram called CIP flow, and others. If you click even further, you can see we're now looking at the CIP1.md file. That's the markdown file that is being displayed on the screen in the rich text rendition. So it doesn't really show well on this page. I invite you to go explore it directly from GitHub to get a better view, and you can scroll down through the text of that CIP itself. So GitHub can be scary. It doesn't have to be, but for the people that are uncomfortable with it, there's an easier way. We created cips.cardano.org as an alternate site to help you browse. So this is going to be simpler. You won't have to be clicking through too many files. You'll get a clearer rendition of buttons and CIP groupings, and you can easily browse and peruse CIPs in a way that will be more understandable and more user-friendly. The way that works is it auto-pulls from the GitHub repository, so everything is always in sync. There's no disconnect once you go to one or the other. The thing is, you won't be able to propose CIP from that site, but you'll be able to browse. So you'll be able to browse and make sense out of it. We've linked that site with the reworked Cardano.org site, so you can access it from there, but at the same time, we'll put some other links in the CIP repository and in the other places where the CIPs are being discussed. The rendition that you're seeing on the screen, so for example, right here, the CIP one, for example, in GitHub does not have a table of contents, but in this case, there's a table of content auto-generated. You can see that you could access all the process CIP by clicking the process button, and it renders things in a much more agreeable layout, typically. Again, the main file of a CIP should be the CIP markdown file, or like we were talking about CIP6, CIP6.md or CIP7.md. That those files have templated sections so that you know where you want to look for what you're looking for. The first one is the preamble or the header. It gives you the bird's eye view on the really significant items for that CIP. So you'll get the title, you'll get the number, the authors, the status, most importantly. What is the status of that CIP? Where does it stand in the process towards active? And of course, the title, when it was created, and the license. The abstract. So the abstract gives you the short description or the gist of the CIP. This is where you'll get the quick information onto what the CIP is about, the motivation, why was the CIP written, why was it formalized, and the specification. This is functionally the main part of the CIP, which gives you extended detail and technical and at the same time descriptive, so that you have the clear idea of what this should be about. Again, the different CIPs will have different needs. So an informational CIP might go a little bit more at length, while a process CIP might focus more on the process steps. And of course, the standards track might be touching to something else as standards keep evolving, and it might be about protocol change. It might be really short. It may be really long. But this should be the main section of that file. The rationale section. The rationale section tells you why specific design decisions were taken rather than others. Sometimes there's conflicting options, and the rationale tells you why things went one way rather than the other. The backwards compatibility section. This is the part where if there are some backwards incompatibilities, they should be listed in. So if there are CIPs that get obsoleted because of that new CIP, they should be listed there. This helps people understand where they might have issues if they were trying to implement one CIP while another one. Let's say that one CIP uses a field that a different CIP invalidates, then that should be listed in that backwards incompatibility section or backwards compatibility section. Reference implementation. This is specific to standards track CIPs. A reference implementation is the actual working code that shows that it is actually implementable. The other option is if you don't have a reference implementation, a standards track CIP cannot process from draft to proposed. It requires a reference implementation before it can be added. The copyright section were Apache for software and Creative Commons for everything else. So if you want to dig a little bit more into this, the formatting guidelines are very thorough and explain at length in CIP1 in that GitHub repository. You should by now be able to navigate all the way to that CIP1.markdown file in the CIP1 directory in that GitHub. Talking about the ecosystem now, the CIPs as elements that can be used to build on and you can build with. You don't have to design all your CIPs. You can use the CIPs from people and the rest of the ecosystem. So CIP as a tool is a communication and collaboration platform. It's something that everyone sees. It's visible. It's out there, and you know where it is. You can go. You can peruse the repository. you can go explore what people are doing, and you can go participate onto what they're doing. If someone is working on a CIP that you want to work on, get involved, talk to that person, and explore what can be done, because we work better together. So cross processes, cross entities, many possibilities. We're going to go into those in a little bit. And of course, it's formal platform, but it is really formally open. So this is an open tool that should be used by the community. You can use it to coordinate. This can be something, and this has already happened. At this point, we've had like pull requests where helping set up processes for IOHK to speak with Emyoko on some specific item, and this might not have to be just IOHK or Emyoko or Cardano Foundation. This could be you setting up a CIP that would help frame things with a third party that might want to work on your area of interest. Again, public and transparent. This is hosted by the Cardano Foundation, which is the nonprofit really intent on growing the Cardano ecosystem as a whole and helping set up the right environment for everyone to be able to work and build using the best infrastructure possible. If there is not a CIP that you think should be there, please get there and write it. And otherwise, do peruse the CIPs that are currently out there. Although right now there's only a few, but if there are some that are of interest, do weigh in on the issues sections of the GitHub pull request or the CIPs themselves, and see which ones might be interesting to you or relevant to your project. There might be like multiple different, find the right one that works for you. An example of cross-process collaboration. In this case, let's say that one CIP was merged into the GitHub repository, but was not moved from draft to proposed because it requires an implementation. So one way that you might get funding for the implementation might be through the Catalyst project that was presented yesterday. So the Catalyst project is a funding mechanism where the community gets to vote on proposals. One logical way of thinking of the CIP is as something that can supplement a funding proposal. So some author for a funding proposal might draft a funding proposal and might push it through by itself through the Catalyst project and get funded or not funded. But one way that that person might increase its chances is to link or refer to that CIP itself in draft format as a way of saying that the idea that I'm trying to get funding for is already being regarded by people in the community as significant and has been formatted in the proper process so that it sounds likely that my proposal should be funded. So that will be what an author might do, and that might be a way to actually get the CIP funded. It might just be like a fully separate process. Understand that it doesn't have to be linked. It doesn't have to be how you get funded. You might get funded from a different way. And for some proposals, for example, might not even fit that model. Let's say that you want to set up a Bitcoin ATM in South Korea or something like that. This is likely not the right platform to do, as in the CIP isn't. CIP is meant to be Cardano global ecosystem or growing, but you might try your chance at getting the funding proposal by itself through the Catalyst project to get funded. So different scopes. However, it is very likely that the Catalyst project is going to focus on global Cardano effort. So this is how the processes will work as parallel processes. They're not connected directly, but they can work together. So this is the CIP process that we were looking at earlier, and you can see that in that process, this is the part where the CIP itself transitions in the GitHub repository and gets numbered. So there's a discussion right before, then there's the formal processing. Right here is where it is at draft status, where it's likely the most interesting point at which that should go through funding if funding is required, or let's say that if like funding doesn't have to be required, so it might be taken into account by another big organization, or you might have a team ready to do it, or it might be financially viable for you to do it without getting the funding. It's a lot of possibilities. But in the greater scheme, the CIP is really there to help people build Cardano. We have the opportunity to open up that platform where people can now try to build up processes, information. This is a centralized platform that is really for the good of the community. And this is the part where the community gets to be involved. And that brings us into Voltaire. Why does that bring us into Voltaire? Well, Voltaire is the greater governance era of Cardano. If we go to the roadmap that was laid out, you should be familiar with those eras. So Byron was foundational. Shelley, which we're currently closing on, is decentralization. Gauguin is smart contracts, battery scaling, and Voltaire is governance. So what does governance has to do with the CIPs? So again, the CIP are not governance. The CIPs are fully distinct from the blockchain itself. What they are is proposals. There's still a review process that goes in the picture, for example, for implementation. IOHK is in charge of implementing Cardano and delivering it. But this is the opportunity for the community to speak up about things they would like to have implemented, or at the same time, way of processes that will grow the ecosystem from there. As you can see, the Shelley and Voltaire and Bashar Gauguin, of course, do overlap. The research has already been started. We're working now on the tools that will go and feed directly into Voltaire later down the line. The CIP is one of those tools. The CIP is definitely a way that the community can communicate and collaborate with the greater Cardano ecosystem. So Voltaire is slowly coming together. It's in the distant future, but it's still there. The parts that are coming into focus, the communication framework, the CIPs are currently right here. The treasury, you're seeing things like the Catalyst project right now that are handling voting and funding proposals. Shelley is feeding from the decentralization side, and decentralized software updates is also one major area of research that has been ongoing with the Privilege project, where specifically looking at how decentralized updates actually function, being that the blockchain and as a decentralized construct gets to be updated if a protocol change is pushed out. So these are the major items right now that are opening up the road to Voltaire. And yes, we're pushing out the CIPs now as a platform for people to start building off. And Catalyst is right here. And we are accelerating really quickly to get to that greater governance era. And we're going through right now with governance experiments, which the Catalyst and the CIP and the decentralized software updates are playing into. Again, even though we're not yet at Voltaire, the time is right now to get started. So the CIP framework is a public tool. Use it. Work to build the ecosystem. Try to lay in place right now the expectations for the tomorrow you want to see. Again, pitch in now, and prepare what you want to see. As for digging deeper, the foundation repo, the GitHub Cardano Foundation repo is a good location to start. There's also a Cardano Effect episode with Matthias Bencourt and Sebastian Guimau, who worked on the CIP process itself and who are also CIP editors. The forums are a good place, the Cardano forums. And of course, try. If you want to try to see a CIP, the first step will probably be to start discussing it. The second step is to try writing it. Once you have that, once you get involved in the process, this is definitely the first step to opening up the door to many CIPs from there and maybe getting involved at the ground floor of a blooming ecosystem, we hope. In closing, I want to touch to the last sentence that Voltaire, Enlightenment writer from France, closed this book Candide with. So the last quote that he used was "Il faut cultiver notre jardin." It translates literally to "we must cultivate our garden," or "let's take care of our garden." It relates to Cardano. Cardano is our garden. It's collective garden. It is important to take care of it, and it is a good time to get involved. On that note, I will close it. Thank you very much, guys. If you have any question, I will be sticking around to answer them. Thank you for putting them in the chat, and I hope that this talk was useful. Thank you very much.